had the US media televised those American wars as fully and vividly as they are televising Russia's war in Ukraine. That is, what if the media had shown us the vast devastation we were causing in those countries, had shown us crying Iraqi and Afghanistani widows and children, shown us the war crimes we were committing in those countries? Had it done so, might not the American people have turned against those wars much sooner than they did? I wonder, too, if our own press today were truly free and honest, would they give the American people a better understanding of the role played by our own country and other NATO countries in providing a rationale for Putin's brutal war in Ukraine, and therefore come to see NATO, in a different and less favorable light? And when I hear the US government calling on the International Criminal Court to file war crimes, charges against Russia, I sure wish the corporate US media would broadcast the fact that the United States does not even let itself be subject to the jurisdiction of that court and has gone out of its way over the years to constantly seek to undermine the work of the ICC. But most of all, when I hear those calls for the prosecution of those responsible for war crimes in Ukraine, I think of Julian Assange. I think of him wasting away in that London jail as the Biden administration continues the Trump administration's persecution and prosecution of Julian. His supposed crimes, publishing classified documents on WikiLeaks that, by the way, neither the New York Times or the Washington Post, forget the Pentagon Papers, were willing to publish, thereby disclosing a multitude of war crimes committed by the United States in Iraq. Oh, unlike the Trump administration, there are as yet no recordings of Biden and his CIA director plotting how they could actually murder Assange. Biden, I guess, plans on murdering Assange in a somewhat more sophisticated and less bloodthirsty way. Well, to address these matters and much more, and to learn what we can do to save Julian Assange and to save what is left of free press in America, let me now introduce our really distinguished and truly terrific panelists. First, given that it is the middle of night where she is at, I think it's like 1 a.m. or something, we're going to take first, and she hopes to stay with us as long as she can. We're going to first hear from Renata Avila Pinto, a Guatemalan lawyer and activist who is a spokesperson and part of that wonderful team defending Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Since 2021, she has been the CEO of the UK-based Open Knowledge Foundation. Ms. Avila Pinto, as a defender of survivors of genocide and other human rights abuses in Guatemala, was part of the team of lawyers representing Rigoberto Menchu against Efraín Ríos Montt. She's also a board member of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, which is a pan-European initiative seeking to democratize the European Union. Attorney Renata Avila Pinto, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jim. I mean, today is a special day. It is the anniversary of the death of Antonio Gramsci, someone that, similarly to Julian Assange, was in prison unjustified. The power put him in prison to try to silence and stop the revolutionary ideas that he was pushing forwards. And it's also, April is an important month because it was the month that Julian released, when Julian released Collateral Murder. And I remember that moment, I met Julian a few years ago. I was one of the few, the earlier crazy volunteers of WikiLeaks, because I was working in the Truth Commission in Guatemala. And while I was working there, it was so frustrating, man. It was so frustrating that everybody knew what was going on and nobody could tell because they were afraid, because laws, because the United Nations, because of bureaucracy, because of many things. And I was like, asking, like there was an international mission there, United Nations mission, and was asking them, please give me the evidence. You know the perpetrators, you know their names. I need that evidence. Please provide it. I don't want memory. I don't want justice in 40 years' time. I want justice now. And people would be like, reluctant and say like, okay, I have a steady job at the United Nations. I cannot tell you. The documents are classified for 50 years. I was like, 50 years? And it's like, Guatemala got a good deal because El Salvador, those documents are classified forever. I was like, how come? My grandmother wants to know where my grandfather is. All the people have a right to truth and justice and accountability. And I was in this crazy trip, I was in my early 20s, not mid-20s to be fair, but let's say early 20s for the public. And I met Julian. I was like, let's fix this. I have people willing to talk, but we need to anonymize. And I love what WikiLeaks does. Like that was 2008, it was just a wiki space. It was just a collaborative space. And the interesting idea and the radical idea that Julian pushed forwards was, okay, you take the courage, I take the risk. If you're courageous enough to reveal truth, I will share that courage with you. And I will bear the responsibility to expose those bastards, basically. And I love that in the early days of WikiLeaks, and maybe because it's very late here, I am more relaxed about speaking about that. One of the slogans of WikiLeaks was, let's crush bastards. And if I think of all the abusers and all the people that, get richer and richer out of, weapons and abuses and exploitation, I love that mission in my early 20s, or mid-20s. And I was like, okay, let's rally for this. And he was applauded. Amnesty International gave him awards, other European institutions gave him awards, and it was all happy story until he touched empire.
Renata, excuse me, just about a minute or so left. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So I will, fast forward. Where is the courage now? Where is that journalist or outlet that will vouch for you if you expose the powerful? It's nowhere to be seen. Because the only person that was left with the courage and the network and the intelligence and the integrity to do so is in prison in Belmarsh. It is not, it is my dear friend, and it is someone I love with all my heart. But it's not only that, it was public service and public interest and tools for freedom removed from you. So that's the initial thought I have. You have been, robbed. You have been deprived from something really powerful when Julian was silenced 3 years ago.
Yes. And you'll have a chance to elaborate on some of that. Well, now our next speaker is Chris Hedges. Investigative journalist Chris Hedges was a member of that Pulitzer Prize winning team reporting on global terrorism for the New York Times. In addition to a long stint at the Times, Mr. Hedges has been a war correspondent as well for National Public Radio, the Dallas Morning News, Christian Science Monitor, and reporting always from, in various times, Latin America, sometimes Middle East, Africa, the Balkans. He's written 12 books, including the bestseller American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War on America. His book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, was a National Book Critics Circle finalist. And his most recent book is America, The Farewell Tour. And I suspect, well, we may hear something from Chris today about what happened on RT. I don't know. Chris Hedges, take it away. I think you need to unmute yourself, Chris.
So the walls have been closing in during my own career as a journalist, which began in Central America in the early 80s, 7 years in the Middle East, 3 years in the former Yugoslavia, ended my career overseas in Paris covering Al-Qaeda. That, I think, was caused by commercial pressure. The flight of classified advertising to places like Craigslist eviscerated 40% of newspaper revenue. The sophistication of digital platforms that can measure our proclivities, our habits, and our desires, and connect us through algorithms with sellers means that the medium of the press is no longer as necessary. And that has caused the press, the commercial press, to become ever more timid because they don't want to lose the remaining commercial interests that they have that sustain them. Just a small case, Stephen Donziger, who got a $9 billion settlement from Chevron, the coverage was practically zero in the New York Times because T-Brand is the advertising firm that is owned by the Times and that Times advertisers use, and their biggest client is Chevron. So there's less and less space for those of us who confront centers of power. Julian, of course, provided the most detailed information in the greatest volume of war crimes, the corruption, the mendacity of the ruling elites around the world. And what he did was essentially function the way alternative press always functions. I write for ScheerPost, run by Bob Scheer, who used to be the editor of Ramparts. So when you're not constricted by commercial interests, then you can actually print the truth. So Ramparts exposes COINTELPRO. Ramparts does some of the first reporting on the atrocities in Vietnam, including that iconic photo of a little girl running naked down a road being burned by napalm. That was Ramparts. And that's what Julian did. But coming out of the traditional media, there was always a deep animus within organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, El País, all these institutions that printed this material. They were shamed into printing the material. That's always the role of the alternative press. It shames the traditional press into doing their job. So if the New York Times had not printed this material, they would have been exposed as the courtiers to the elites that they largely are. But that essentially fostered an antagonism between them and Julian, which is why the moment that stuff was published, and they won all sorts of prizes for it, they turned around to lynch Julian. That's what happened. And it has been very short-sighted on the part of the press. Marjorie has spoken to this, as have others, because if Julian is extradited, and I hate to say it, but I think we must begin to plan for that possibility and how we are going to resist if he is here in Virginia with Cromberg. The fact is that Julian has, and of course much of it was orchestrated by this kind of smear campaign against him. And Niels Melzer's book, by the way, is probably the best, I think, explication. He speaks Swedish of all of the things that have been done to Julian. But if Julian is extradited, if Julian is found guilty under the Espionage Act, although of course he's not an American citizen, and WikiLeaks is not a U.S.-based publication. The whole thing is legal farce. I've sat through several of the hearings in London. But if he is, and he is found guilty, then essentially what it does is legally make the possession of classified documents, and I possessed classified documents as a reporter for the New York Times and published them, but it makes the possession of classified documents and the publication of those documents a crime, which essentially ends any investigations into the inner workings of power. So on a personal level, It's devastating to Julian and his family, but also on the level of press freedom, it's a kind of death blow to our ability to hold the global power elites accountable. Thank you.
Jim,
Jim,
you're
unmute
muted.
yourself.
You're muted. No.
I'm not following my own directions. I didn't unmute myself. And now we're going to hear from one of America's leading peace activists, Medea Benjamin, who, along with Jody Evans and others, founded the dynamic peace action group CodePink. Along with author and activist Kevin Danaher, she created the fair trade advocacy group Global Exchange. In 2000, she ran on the Green ticket as a US Senate candidate and received the highest number of votes ever for a Green Party candidate running for Senate. Her editorial comments and articles have appeared in many publications. We were anxious to hear from Medea today because I think it's fair to say that there is some difference of opinion today between various wings of the anti-war movement as to the best and proper way to address this war and to function as a peace activist group. So Medea Benjamin, your opening remarks, please.
Thank you so much, Jim, for inviting me. My background is behind me is the mountains of Afghanistan. I just came back from Afghanistan, and I thought a lot about Julian Assange while we were there, because 20 years ago when the US first invaded, I don't know if you all remember the scenes in the US media, which was that we now have smart bombs, precision bombs, we hit the bad guys and not civilians. And soon after the war started, I went to Pakistan and then into Afghanistan and saw the devastation, the thousands of people who were fleeing the country, whose loved ones had been killed. We took videos, we took photos, and we came back to Washington, D.C., to the National Press Club and held a press event and thought, the U.S. media is going to really want to cover this. No US media even came. And they didn't care about the civilian casualties. They didn't care about what became of the 6 million internally displaced and refugees of Afghanistan. And that made it very hard, as Jim said in his opening, to build an anti-war movement. And I think it is one of the reasons that the war dragged on for 20 years. But we did have WikiLeaks exposing the Afghan war diaries. And that was a huge help to us as activists, because in the over 100,000 documents that were released was evidence of thousands and thousands of civilian casualties. And we used that to go to the government in the United States and demand a compensation fund for Afghan victims, which we did get. So fast forward today, and we have the war in Ukraine. All of a sudden, the media does care about civilian casualties. The media does care about refugees. And it shows that the American people do care about these issues. Their hearts go out to the people who are being harmed. The problem is, though, that the media narrative is to push the war even more by saying that pouring weapons into this struggle is a way to help the Ukrainians. And that has really confused people. People who would normally be part of an anti-war movement are now saying we should send more weapons to Ukraine. People who expose the facts about NATO expansion, the US role in the 2014 coup, the US pouring weapons in from that time on, US support for non-compliance with the Minsk agreements. If you just talk about those issues, you are labeled as pro-Putin. And so it makes it very difficult to organize. When the war, Russia invaded, just a couple of days after, we called for actions, people to get out on the street, and we did get a good response. We got about 125 cities participating. But as the war went on and the media pushed the narrative of a pro-war, less and less people started coming out to these. And now we have a day of action that we're calling for May 7th, and it's been very, very difficult to get people to want to come out. Of course, as wars drag on, people are less motivated. But this is only 2 months, and if we don't get involved, this war will drag on for years and years to come, as some in the US government might want as a way to debilitate Russia. So we are calling people to get out on the streets on May 7th. I'll put in the chat box the website called peaceinukraine.org. And if you don't think you can get many people out for a rally, which is true in most places around the US, just take a couple of friends of yours, download the flyer that we have, and go out and talk to people in farmers markets, at post offices, in your parks, wherever people are congregated. Let's do this in the name of Julian Assange. As we work to free him, let us work to spread the truth that the only way to end this war is by negotiations and a ceasefire. That if you want to save lives of people in Ukraine, you have to help us build a global movement to end the war, and not only the war in Ukraine, but all wars. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Medea. Well, now it's my pleasure to introduce our next panelist, who is Vijay Prashad. Mr. Prashad is an Indian Marxist historian and political commentator and activist. He is executive director of the Transcontinental Institute for Social Research. This is an organization about building knowledge from the experience of, well, social and cultural transformations brought about by popular struggle. Mr. Prashad is the chief editor of Leftward Books and is a senior non-resident fellow at Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. Vijay Prashad co-founded the Forum on Indian Leftists and has, well, brilliantly expressed his views on capitalism in his book, Fat Cats and Running Dogs. Vijay Prashad, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm joining you from the very great city of Buenos Aires, from where I'm sitting, just a few kilometers away, the general head of US Southern Command made her appearance in Argentina. Now, countries like Argentina and the people of these countries should always fear when US generals come aboard, because they bring with them the potential, the sinister potential of death and destruction. Let's face it, friends. I mean, I agree entirely with what Medea said, but let's face it. The elite in the United States is both extremely dangerous and sinister and quite ridiculous. It's extremely dangerous and sinister because it has a capacity to heartlessly destroy countries, as it had destroyed Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, in a way, Yemen as well. It's more the British, though, that are arming the Saudis, but the United States as well. It's extremely dangerous elite, extremely dangerous, extremely sinister, but also ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It lies right in the face of the evidence. Let's take one example. In 2010, WikiLeaks released a videotape, very important videotape from the US government's archive, from its own materials. What did the videotape show? It showed that in 2007, in July, Apache helicopters flew into New Baghdad city and absolutely without provocation, killed Reuters personnel, also fired into a van and badly hurt two children, one age 10, that's Sajjad Mutashar, and one age 5, Doha Mutashar, both terribly, terribly badly hurt. Their father was killed on the spot. That was in 2007. Interestingly, 2 years later, the Washington Post's highly respected journalist, David Finkel, published a book called The Good Soldiers, in which Finkel basically admitted watching the video from the Apache helicopters of those killings. And Finkel wrote in The Good Soldiers, a book published by a reputed publishing house in the United States. Just to repeat, he's a Washington Post correspondent. Finkel said the Apache crew followed the rules of engagement. That's what Finkel wrote. The US government denied that there was a video. Denied. Yet a Washington Post reporter who watched that video and said there was no war crime. He said there's a video. He said ridiculous elite. I mean, the US elite is ridiculous. On the one side, the state says there's no video. On the other side, a stenographer, a State Department stenographer at the Washington Post says, I've seen the video, but there's no war crime. If not for WikiLeaks, we would not be able to show that David Finkel has no idea what international law is and what the rules of engagement are. Without that video, we would have no ability directly, as Medea said, to show that the US state is totally a mendacious, lying institution. The United States elite is ridiculous. It's dangerous and ridiculous. It's incumbent upon people around the world and people in the United States to do something about that damned elite, which is bringing us nearer and nearer to annihilation. On the one side, perilously close to nuclear encounters. On the other side, accelerating us into climate destruction. I mean, this is the nature of the US elite. Here's Joe Biden lecturing the world about human rights. For God's sake, man, Joe Biden, you voted for that war in Iraq, a war peppered with war crimes revealed to us by the WikiLeaks Foundation, revealed to us. Julian Assange is sitting in jail. Today, Joe Biden is lecturing us about human rights. Julian Assange is sitting in jail. Today, Tony Blair is giving us advice about human rights. For God's sake, people, this is a ridiculous elite, not only in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom. It's ridiculous. I have no respect for the elite in the United States. And I'm asking people in the United States, for God's sake, I can't believe that you're falling for the garbage they're selling you about the war in Ukraine, blonde hair and blue eyes. Those refugees, their lives matter. Their lives matter. The lives of the Iraqis didn't matter a jot.
1 minute, Jeff.
Yes, their lives matter. The lives of the Iraqis don't matter a jot. Within 10 seconds, the International Criminal Court decides open a file on the Russian military actions in Ukraine. Where's the file on Iraq? Where's the file on Afghanistan? Where's the real file on the Palestinian issue with the Israelis conducting brutal attacks against the Palestinians? So easy that they use the word war crimes to describe what's happening in Ukraine. Where's the war crime? The whole country of Iraq is a war crime. The country of Libya is a war crime. For God's sake, it's a ridiculous elite. It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous elite. Julian Assange should be celebrated. George Bush and Tony Blair should be in Belmarsh prison.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, now our final speaker, Marjorie Cohn, Professor Emerita at the Thomas Jefferson School of Law, and former president, I'm proud to say, of the National Lawyers Guild. Professor Cohn is a member of the Bureau of International Association of Democratic Lawyers, a member of the advisory board of Veterans for Peace, and as I am, a co-host of the nationally syndicated radio show, Law and Disorder. Professor Cohn's books include Drones and Targeted Killing, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues. She's a regular contributor to truthout.org, and today she'll lay out some important information concerning war crimes and the International Criminal Court. Professor Marjorie Cohn.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to all my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be with you all, and to the participants and the attendees. At Nuremberg, the war of aggression, the crime of aggression, was considered to be the supreme international crime because it subsumed within itself all of the war crimes. And Justice Robert Jackson, who took a leave from the Supreme Court to be chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, said that when there are war crimes, they're crimes whether the United States commits them or whether Germany commits them. And it's true today. War crimes are war crimes, whether Russia commits them, whether Ukraine commits them, and certainly we know, as many people have said already, that the United States has committed war crimes, and indeed the crime of aggression in many wars, in Kosovo, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and the list goes on and on and on. A war of aggression is the use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of any other state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the UN Charter. The UN Charter requires diplomacy and forbids the use of military force against another country unless it is conducted in self-defense after an armed attack by another country or with the permission of the Security Council. Neither of those things was present before Russia attacked Ukraine, and therefore Russia is committing aggression and Russian leaders can be tried for the crime of aggression. I want to briefly define war crimes. Under the Geneva Conventions and the protocol, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, extensive destruction or appropriation of property, and launching indiscriminate attacks against civilians or civilian objects. Certainly, WikiLeaks, and some people have referred to this, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, the reason that Julian Assange, and the only reason that Julian Assange is facing 175 years in prison under the Espionage Act is because of WikiLeaks' revelation of war crimes and other sensitive classified documents. And we're talking about war crimes committed by the US government in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Guantanamo. And the collateral murder video to which Vijay referred shows evidence of 3 separate war crimes under the Geneva Conventions. On February 28th, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court convened an investigation into the situation in Ukraine, and he said that the ICC would investigate war crimes by any party to the conflict. And on the 18th of April, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said that there is growing evidence of war crimes in Ukraine, with accusations leveled against both sides. On the 22nd of April, the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights office said that Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas, killing civilians and wrecking hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructure. There have been extensive reports of rape, and this is by Russian forces. Rape constitutes torture and constitutes a war crime. There is also a war crime which is intentionally launching an attack with the knowledge that the attack will cause widespread and long-term severe damage to the natural environment. The seizure of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster site mobilized radioactive dust and increased detectable radiation that could spread radioactive material into widespread areas. There are also crimes against humanity. We've talked about aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, which are committed in the context of large-scale attacks targeting civilians. Crimes against humanity include torture, include persecution against an identifiable group, and other inhumane acts, intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health. There have been documentation of Ukraine using cluster bombs. In fact, on April the 19th, the New York Times reported that the Ukrainians were using cluster bombs, and cluster bombs violate the Convention on Cluster Munitions because they spread tiny bomblets, which then blow up, and some of them remain dormant. Children step on them and then they blow up, and that also can constitute a crime against humanity. Now, the International Criminal Court does have jurisdiction to prosecute crimes against humanity and war crimes against Russians, against Ukrainians, but does not have jurisdiction to prosecute the crime of aggression for various reasons. Will that happen? I don't know. In one of the most hypocritical statements ever made, the US Senate, which can't agree on anything, voted 100-0 to ask the International Criminal Court to get involved and try Russians for war crimes and crimes against humanity. After the United States has spent over 50 years trying to undermine the International Criminal Court. And I just want to end with the second paragraph of that Senate resolution. It says, whereas the United States of America is a beacon for the values of freedom, democracy, and human rights across the globe, ... And then the resolution goes on. That is the height of hypocrisy, given the fact that the US government continues to commit war crimes all over this world. Every president has done that. And there are war crimes being committed in Ukraine. And we need to call for prosecution, first of all, an end, a diplomatic settlement, of course, as Medea said, but also bringing to justice, if not in the International Criminal Court, then in other countries under universal jurisdiction, those people and those leaders who are guilty of war crimes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Cohn. Thank you for that. Now, as I announced when we started this, I've got a few questions of my own I'm going to put to the panelists. And by the way, panelists, I'm not going to put them to a particular panelist, I don't think. I just want to give a chance to anyone who wants to comment on what I'm commenting on or asking a question about to do so. So just jump in, and we'll move on to another question or two, and then we'll get to questions from our audience, those who are participating with us today. And again, thinking about, and this was inspired a bit by something I think the VJ said, but thinking about the coverage that the U.S. media is giving to the war in Ukraine, and the difference between what they've done with wars involving people of color, whereas here, as I think VJ said, you've got white, blue-eyed looking Europeans who look more like us and so forth. We get certainly a very rosy picture, a completely rosy picture of Ukraine and who it is and why we should spend all of our tax dollars, of course, defending it. I guess I'm wondering, do any of the panelists think it's also, though, the responsibility of an honest, truthful press at a time of war, letting us know some other aspects of Ukraine? Wonderful people, but the fact of the matter is we don't hear much about the fact that the current government has really frozen out a dozen or more independent media sources in Ukraine, has kind of grouped them under one central dispatcher of the news that's controlled pretty much by the Zelensky government. We don't hear about the fact that opposition parties, particularly socialist opposition parties, have been effectively outlawed by the Zelensky government. We seldom hear about the war crimes that were just mentioned in some cases by Professor Cohn, committed by the forces of the Ukraine, and so forth and so on. I wonder, panelists, am I being too harsh on the media? Or am I right? Is this not something that the media should be presenting to the American people as well as they judge what our country should and shouldn't do in the days ahead? Who has their hand up, or just, or maybe that's a dumb question. I don't know. It concerns me. Anyone else want to make a comment on that at all? Okay, I'll move right along in that case.
No,
The
no, no.
other-
I think we should. I think we should talk about that, Jim.
Thank you.
Yeah. I also have a comment.
Here, why don't you
Oh,
start,
please,
Renata?
go ahead, Medea.
Yeah, like it
Or
is very
whoever.
interesting because what I work in, like is access to knowledge, archives, fight against corruption, all the things that, WikiLeaks used to. And it really broke my heart because it is like, in our communities in Russia and Ukraine, it was a synergy, we were doing work together. We were like exposing the corrupt. We were like opening archives. We were like doing efforts to like make transparent these bad things going on, and all the narrative in media, like, like in our communities, geek people like Julian behind computers trying to expose truth. We were shocked because the narratives that we were hearing were completely different to the reality that we were living. And it was a sprint. You will be like surprised to hear, or maybe unsurprised to hear, the race of our communities. I will not name people because of security, of course, to save archives, to save records, to, like to keep safe the information that we will need to expose the real bastards of this war, and it was very, very, very interesting how fast the powerful wanted to wipe information out of the internet and how effective they were to do so.
Yes.
And so just that small comment, because it is not different from what happened in Guatemala when the army was burning books, and prosecuting intellectuals.
Right.
I think that that's my comment. And sometimes, mainstream journalists are so separate from our communities and so coward to defend what is truth. That's exactly what happened to Julian,
Mm-hmm.
The comfort of a position in a fancy newspaper is so pathetic, it's extremely pathetic before my eyes. You throw your comrades under the bus because of, I don't know, free coffee and a mediocre paycheck.
Yes.
That's the same.
Yes.
That's the same situation that we are seeing now.
All right. And Medea, I noticed Vijay's hand is up, but Medea, did you want to comment on this as well?
Yes, I think it is unfortunate that the media has taken Zelensky as an icon and elevated him without talking about the issues like the fact that he campaigned on a peace platform, but when he got in, he did not do anything to comply with the Minsk agreements. And from Russia's point of view, one of the key reasons that the war happened is because there was not compliance with those agreements. And of course, there's the other issues like the neo-Nazis in the Azov battalion, like the issues that you brought up, Jim, about how this war has been, a casualty of the war has been free press inside Ukraine, the conscription of young men in Ukraine. We have friends who are part of a war resistors group and they don't want to fight. So the media has not done its job in showing the problems in the Ukraine government now or earlier. And I think that's one of the reasons that the US people see this in such black and white terms.
Mm-hmm. BJ.
Yeah, if you look at the New York Times headline today, it talks about Russia's decision to shut down gas shipments to two European countries, Poland and I think Bulgaria. The headline for the story, and Chris knows that headlines are not developed by the journalist, but by the desk. So you can't blame the reporter, but still, I can come to that in a minute. The headline basically takes a word from a high European Union official, and the word is blackmail. What she says is that Russia is blackmailing these European countries. The shutting off of gas is a form of blackmail. Now, that's really interesting. The entire story is actually written around the framework put forward by the European Union high official. It's very interesting from the standpoint of basically facts and reason. It's very interesting because currently, if you go to the OFAC website, which is the US Treasury Department website around US sanctions against a number of countries, some of them based on arcane laws like Trading with the Enemy Act from 1917. If you go to the OFAC website, the US Treasury Department, you'll find that the US government has, in some cases for decades, for instance, regarding Cuba, has sanctioned and continues to harshly sanction over 30 countries. Now, I have never, ever seen the New York Times use the word blackmail to describe how the US government utilizes economic force against Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Zimbabwe. If you want, I can continue, but I think the point is made. What press are you talking about when you ask questions of things like the New York Times? What press are you talking about? Mm-hmm. What are we talking about? This is not a media. This is a joke. I remember being a reporter in Lebanon, watching the way the Western press covered Hezbollah. I remember this, the way they covered the Syria war. They felt perfectly comfortable going into so-called government-controlled areas of Syria. They were terrified to go into rebel-controlled areas of Syria. These same rebels that they then extolled in their dispatches, talking about how these were freedom fighters, bringing freedom to Syria. If these were such great freedom fighters, why didn't they go into the Kalamun Mountains and hang out with the Al-Qaeda guys? Why didn't they go to northern Syria and hang out with ISIS? Why weren't they doing that? I mean, they were making up stuff. New York Times ran a podcast supposedly based on an ISIS fighter. Turned out the whole thing was a scam. What kind of reporting is this? These are basically congenital liars. I failed to be able to give them the respect due to people in my profession. Go look at this headline, blackmail. Russia is blackmailing. What the hell has the United States been doing to Cuba? Yeah. Is that not a form of blackmail, suffocation? Call it what you will. The United States claims that it's within its rights to behave in such a way against Cuba. All that Russia is saying now is we're not going to provide gas to Poland. That's a decision a country can make against another country. If it's done by the United States, that's okay. If it's done by any other country, particularly an adversary, it's a criminal act. You do the math.
Thank you, Vijay. No, thank you. And that leads to something else I've been wondering about. As we talk about this kind of blanket glowing way in which the people of Ukraine, who are good people, are presented to us without, the flaws of the government, what have you, and send more billions and billions of weapons and what have you. And we talk about what will bring, Putin to the bargaining table and so forth and so on. I think about the oil questions that you were talking about. We talk about the fact that if Germany can't get along without the oil from Russia, it helps Russia maintain a certain economic strength and therefore continue the war. But we now know, and this much has been reported, we now know that the fossil fuel manufacturers in the United States could produce more than enough oil for Germany and Poland and anyone else that for one reason or another couldn't have Russian oil. Of course, if they did that, the price of oil would go down. And there's a fear the profits of the oil companies would go down. Does not the media coverage, though, make the American people, first of all, not examine that too closely and nod and say yes to anything the government wants to do with their tax dollars when it comes to defending Ukraine and hiding behind all sorts of things like the oil? Hey, the government could could put price controls on the oil if it was worried about the price of the oil, but it doesn't do that either. I guess I'm just wondering if you want to talk about this cozy relationship and how the press serves the interest of corporate America, and in this case, the fossil fuel industries in particular. Anyone want to chime in a bit on that? Chris?
Jim, I'd like to say something.
Marjorie, please. I think, Chris, I think you may be still muted. Yes, Marjorie?
I want to say that US and other NATO countries have been levying sanctions against Russia, horrific sanctions, since this war began, which have crippled the Russian economy and hurt the people of Russia. And these are called unilateral coercive measures, and they are illegal under the UN Charter, because under the Charter, only the Security Council has the right and the power to order sanctions. And yet the United States, not just Cuba, not just Venezuela, not just Nicaragua, and on and on and on, but also right now in Russia, people are suffering from these illegal unilateral coercive measures, and yet the corporate media, and I think we need to call it the corporate media. It is not the mainstream media.
Right.
It is the corporate media. It's owned by the corporations. We are the alternative media. And the corporate media only gives us this very one-sided picture. It's fine. Anything NATO does is wonderful. Anything the United States does is great, and it is up to us in the alternative media, and all of my fellow panelists are active in the alternative media, to get the word out.
Thank you for that. By the way, Renata's had to leave us. I mentioned at the start of all of this, she's had quite a work day. It was 1 a.m. her time. It's now 2 a.m. her time. So we said, go to bed, Renata. You got a lot of work to do tomorrow. So she takes her leave, and we thank her so much for being with us. Yeah, Chris, I'm sorry. Was I anticipating, or it looked like you wanted to say something about this? I would just note, by the way, those sanctions are hurting the American people too, by the way, Marjorie, you're right. But Chris, did you have a comment on this?
Well, it's several people have spoken to this, Vijay and Medea and others, but it's the hypocrisy of foreign policy. It's what Chomsky and Ed Herman called worthy and unworthy victims. So in any conflict, you create worthy victims. It helps, of course, when they're white. Unworthy victims are Yemenis. For 7 years, 230,000 dead, malnutrition, famine, cholera epidemics. They're not worthy. Iraqis are not worthy. Syrians are not worthy. And that's always been true in every conflict that I covered. I mean, for instance, I was in El Salvador and covering the conflicts in Central America in the early 80s. You had a Polish priest who was apparently murdered by the Solidarity government, and the Reagan administration held up the murder of that priest constantly as a way to excoriate the communist government in Warsaw. Well, in El Salvador, we had Archbishop Oscar Romero assassinated, 4 American church women raped and killed. I think by the time the conflict was done, close to 20 priests had been murdered. But there wasn't a word. In fact, you had Jean Kirkpatrick, who was at the UN, Secretary of State Alexander Haig, casting aspersions against these clerics and church people to essentially justify their murder. That's always been the case. And we can't hope to prevent war and war crimes until we have a rule-based system. So when the rules only apply to Putin and they don't apply to us, when we continue to play this game of worthy and unworthy victims, we go nowhere. And I would just close by saying that much of this embrace of worthy victims is really about self-adulation. It's about our wrapping ourselves in some kind of moral purity that I think after 20 years in Iraq, we look the other way. And so there's a kind of giddiness. And of course, the press is, one of the largest purveyors of this lie. But they're catering to an emotional desire on the part of the American public at the expense of truth.
Can I add something about the
please do, Medea.
Yeah, just on the fossil fuel issue, I want to mention that on the one hand, it's good that environmentalists are making the connection between the environment and war. On the other hand, there's hypocrisy in some of their stands as well, because they're saying, get off, punish Russia and get off the fossil fuel treadmill that puts us in bed with Vladimir Putin. And then you see that the Biden administration is going to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to ask them to increase their fuel production. You even have in the media people like Fareed Zakaria on his CNN show saying that as much as he was an admirer of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and didn't like that he was chopped up and dissolved in chemical liquids by the Mohammed bin Salman. And what he didn't say is, aside from the fact that Mohammed bin Salman is prosecuting a horrific war in Yemen that has gone on for 7 years now, because of the Ukraine situation and the need to isolate Russia, we must get our ducks in order and have our friends in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates producing more oil. And the environmental groups have not shown how hypocritical that is, have gone along with this narrative as if the only oligarch that produces oil is Russia, is Putin. And I think we need to educate them. On the other hand, just to end on this, this topic, I do think that their call, and more than 200 groups have been calling on Biden to use the Defense Production Act to get us into a crash course on green energy, is certainly something that we should all get behind.
All right. In order to honor the schedule that we set out, I'm going to ask one more question of well, actually, I'm not. I'm going to go right to the questions I think now from our audience, because there are a bunch of them. And the first one, though, is directed to you, actually, Medea, I suppose, without mentioning your name exactly. But I want anyone else to chime in. That's fair game with all these questions. But I say maybe you want to start with Medea, only because the question is this from Anne. How can the peace community and the Assange defense community join forces at the national level and to advance both causes?
Well, many of us are already doing that. The fact that we're on this call is an example of that. Many people in the peace community have been supporting WikiLeaks from the time of their exposing the US war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. We didn't get sidetracked when there was exposés of Hillary Clinton's memos that made the whole many in the Democratic Party lose interest in Julian Assange. And we have continued to thank him and WikiLeaks for the service of exposing the truth and been pushing for him not to be extradited. And I see many of the same people that are part of that community are also part of the anti-war community. In both cases, we have to do more and we have to do it better. I don't feel that we have the answers. If we did, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now, where not only can't we put enough pressure on the Biden administration for them to drop the case against Julian Assange, but we haven't been able to stop wars, and we have an increased Pentagon budget right now that is 60 billion larger than what Biden even asked for. So I would appreciate some advice from people about how we could do a better job on both fronts.
Anyone else want to offer a thought in response to Medea on that?
Jim?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Marjorie?
I think it's really important when people, especially some people on the left, some liberals, some people in the Democratic Party, to which Medea alluded, talk about things like Hillary Clinton's emails and what the DNC did to subvert Bernie Sanders, et cetera, that we make it very clear that the reason that Julian Assange has been indicted by the Trump administration and Biden is continuing that request for extradition to try him is from the 2010 revelations by WikiLeaks and Julian Assange of evidence of war crimes in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Guantanamo, in that collateral murder video and State Department cables. That's the reason. And if we can link the war crimes committed by the US forces that were revealed by WikiLeaks and Julian Assange with the revelation of war crimes now being committed in in Ukraine, I think that that's an important connection that we need to make.
Mm-hmm. All right. This is a question. Well, it was a question for Renata, but I think that others may be able to answer it. And I'll ask it in conjunction with another question as well that's related to it. But someone had asked the question, how can we use WikiLeaks documents to hold governments accountable? And given all of the issues that surround that, I mean, the prosecution of Assange and so forth. And what I would add to that is, it seems to me that that's tied in very closely with the prosecution of Assange. Earlier, we said that while all hope is not lost, we fear that he is going to be extradited back to the United States, stand trial in a very conservative district in Virginia, where he faces 175 years in prison. The US Justice Department or Biden could stop this. The Obama administration had decided not to go forward with the actual prosecution of Assange. So I wonder what our panelists think is the best way to perhaps bring pressure at this point on the US government around WikiLeaks, but more importantly, around the prosecution of Julian Assange, if indeed he is indicted back here to the United States. That's certainly uppermost in my mind, and I know in the minds of lots of folks who joined us today, because the matter of Julian Assange, as much as the war in Ukraine, is very much on their mind. Now, who would like to offer perhaps some thoughts on that? And let me just say before you start to do that, if you go to, AssangeDefense.org, you go to AssangeDefense.org, you will see petitions to the Attorney General, and you will see all sorts of other things that the national and local defense committees are doing on behalf of Julian. And please, when this is all over, if you aren't already part of that cause, please make yourself part of that cause. But in terms of the best strategy for that, Chris, it looked like you were about to say something.
Yeah, this is going to have to be my last because I have to go. But we have to do the kinds of things that Medea does really well. We have to make public protests because clearly the elites themselves are immune to the truth. I mean, we can go back to Snowden, which of course, and Julian was instrumental in making sure Snowden didn't end up in US hands. But all of those revelations, so a clear violation of our right to privacy, and yet the Obama administration did nothing. I think the reason that they're so virulent now against Julian comes from Vault 7. So these were the exposure of the CIA tools to hack into our smart cars and televisions and phones and everything else. So they have everything, kind of these back channel mechanisms. And at that point, his fate was sealed. And that's why Trump really couldn't even consider pardoning Assange. And it's why Biden has prosecuted this extradition case in London, begun by the Trump administration. I think it's fueled by the intelligence community. And we're, of course, hamstrung by the fact that the press itself is so anemic. But we have to make as much noise as we can. They feel it. I mean, I was invited to go one of 6 guests for Julian's wedding in Belmarsh. And then when I and Craig Murray and the others got there, they scratched us off the list because they didn't want us to write about it. Of course, we wrote about it anyway. I mean, I can reconstruct what happened inside Belmarsh by interviewing Stella and everybody who was in Belmarsh, John and everyone else. And that article is called "The Marriage of Julian Assange," which you can find on chrishedges.substack.com. So I think we have to make as much noise as we can. I think that we do have to prepare for his extradition so we're not caught off guard. Let's pray that it doesn't happen, but if it does, let's be prepared. This is now our country. It's not the UK, and I have flown several times over to London to sit in on the hearings. But then it's really incumbent upon us because the consequences of this, again, personally for Julian, and he's in very poor health, we should acknowledge.
Yes.
He's had a stroke, he's on antidepressants, he's lost a lot of weight, he has had psychotic episodes, as anybody would with that kind of prolonged torture, a psychological torture, which Niels Melzer correctly calls it. So we have to begin, I think, to anticipate. I think these legal dance will, by everything I can tell, will probably go on for another 12 months. But having covered it, I don't think there's any question that he's being railroaded. I mean, just the fact that UC Global, the Spanish security firm in the embassy, recorded all of his meetings with his attorneys and turned it over to the US government, violating attorney-client privilege, alone invalidates the case. And I could go into all sorts of other details. I mean, it really is judicial farce. It's just, it's utterly bankrupt and it kinds of Dickensian almost. So having watched it up close for that long and seeing the corruption within the UK legal system, I don't hold out a lot of hope. So we have to be prepared. If Julian is extradited, we have to be ready. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and just to Marjorie, I'll call you in a second, just to remind people again, in light of what Chris has just said, action is the word. I think that's absolutely true. When you go to AssangeDefense.org, if you go to AssangeDefense.org /take-action /. So there is a separate committee, a part of our national network of defense for Assange, working on and organizing just exactly the kinds of public actions that Chris, I think, has quite rightly said is what is needed, in addition to the letter writing and the petition signing and the webinars and all the other things that one does. There has to be an awareness of that in the streets if we're going to actually have a hope of bringing the kind of pressure necessary on the Biden administration, which is why I appreciated the early question of how the anti-war movement, which has a history of being in the streets in this country, a long history, an illustrious history, picking up, as they have begun to do on some right from the beginning, the Assange cause, because that relates to war and peace too. And they are a model for us of how you get in the streets, as Chris is suggesting. So AssangeDefense.org /take-action / Marjorie, you wanted to say something.
Yes, I think it's really important that when we talk to people, when we write about it, when we do media about it, we talk about the threat to investigative journalism that is posed by the prosecution and persecution of Julian Assange. WikiLeaks did nothing different than what the New York Times, the Washington Post, or Spiegel, Le Monde did, which was to publish classified information. That is what investigative journalists do all the time. And and they pull out the national security card. Well, it hurt national security. That's what they said continually at Julian Assange's extradition hearing. But as Noam Chomsky said, who is one of the 3 co-chairs of Assange defense, national security is what the government pulls out whenever it doesn't want people to know what it is doing in their name. And the Obama administration, which prosecuted more whistleblowers than all prior presidents combined, did not choose to indict Julian Assange, who is a journalist. Chelsea Manning was the whistleblower. He's a journalist, because they were worried about the New York Times problem, because then they would have to prosecute the New York Times and all of these other,
That's right.
Other stations, other media outlets.
I wonder, Marjorie, because we've had some people wondering about this as well. It's no secret that the U.S. media has not been very kind to Julian Assange from the beginning, and yet he's one of theirs. He's an investigative reporter. We can all speculate on reasons for that, but even the New York Times, when they write about him, seldom really mentions the collateral damage video or the kinds of of war crimes that he exposed from the US, et cetera, et cetera. So they have not done a good job of educating the American people why he should be defended as he should. Would you agree with that assessment of the media's role in how they've handled or responded to the indictment of Assange?
Only if you call it the corporate media.
A corporate media.
Yes,
No,
yes.
you're right. I'm not
Yes,
talking about Truth Out or any
No,
of those.
We need to use that as a mantra. We're talking about the corporate media.
Corporate media.
And when Julian Assange was first indicted, there were articles in the New York Times protesting that indictment.
Yeah.
But there is radio silence now from the corporate media. And that's why we have to continue to agitate in every way we can, not just in the media, but also, of course, with mass action, which Assange Defense and other groups are doing so well.
Well, we're getting ready to wrap up now. I think that Medea or Vijay, did you have some last comments on, especially on what we need to do to save Assange and to strike a blow for the real freedom of the press before we end today? Maybe yes, maybe no. They can't see each other.
DJ, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, Vijay, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I may have my timeline wrong, but I think I remember that when it was revealed in 2019, and by the way, in April 2019, two things happened simultaneously. A friend of mine, Ola Bini, was picked up at the Quito, Ecuador airport and held in prison in Ecuador for several months. He now sits in Ecuador, unable to leave the country, even though he has Swedish nationality. He was immediately accused by the Ecuadorian government of various technology crimes. It became clear to us, including to Joshua Goodman of the Associated Press, that the United States government was interested in Ola Bini because Ola had gone to visit Julian at the London embassy several times. A few hours after they picked up Ola, Julian was removed from the embassy in London. Why I'm saying this is because, just as Marjorie just said, what WikiLeaks did was provide the corporate media, I hope that's okay, Marjorie, provide the corporate media with texts, documents that they then published. WikiLeaks did not break into US government sites and so on. What the US government was having a hard time doing was establishing that Julian Assange collaborated with Chelsea Manning to break into US government sites. Now, anybody who knows Julian knows he's actually not that great with basic technology. He's very smart about a lot of things, but Julian is even prone to losing his own password. They wanted to find the hacker who worked with Julian. That was their allegation. And they wanted to pin this on Ola Bini, because Ola is one of the principal, most brilliant code writers in the world. And they wanted, in a sense, to demonstrate that Ola was the key breaker for Julian, collaborating with Chelsea Manning to break into the US government site and then use the Espionage Act. These are vicious people, frankly. Ola Bini has spent since 2019 in effective house arrest in Quito, Ecuador. He only met Julian Assange in the London embassy of Ecuador. This is long after Chelsea Manning had sent the files to WikiLeaks. It's ridiculous, it's ludicrous, frankly. Any reasonable court would have immediately thrown out the allegations against Ola Bini. Why am I saying all these things? It sounds crazy. Well, in 2019, when these two arrests took place, I was very interested, and I might have got the timeline wrong, so you can correct me. I was very interested that Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and I think a few other US senators complained that the US government, in its sealed indictment against Assange, used the Espionage Act. I believe that it's after Assange was removed from the Ecuador embassy, and it was revealed that the Espionage Act was going to be used against Assange. You see, if Assange was merely going to be charged with various infractions of use of confidential materials, there are fines, there is a very short time in prison, perhaps, whatever, it's nothing. They were going to punish Assange for revealing, as Marjorie pointed out, for revealing so-called classified information. You know, this should be public information. This is war crimes.
Yes.
The ICC should have jumped on this. Sanders and Warren came out against the use of the Espionage Act. Now, as far as I know, Sanders and Warren have gone radio silent on the Assange case, as far as I know. And Medea, it would be very interesting to remind Bernie Sanders and to remind Elizabeth Warren, in a way only you can, that CodePink can. It would be interesting to go to Bernie Sanders' office in Vermont and in Washington, go to Elizabeth Warren's office in Boston and in Washington, and remind them that they criticized the Trump administration for wanting to use the Espionage Act against Julian Assange. Why are they silent now when it looks like extradition is going to take place? If 2, 4, 6 senior US senators come out in public and start hammering again on this use of the Espionage Act against Julian Assange, when the extradition is imminent, if they come out in public, how would it be possible for the media to be so silent? Might others not join, particularly Congress people? There's an abominable use of the Espionage Act given particularly, and I'm not a lawyer, let alone a lawyer in the American court system, but it seems an abomination to charge a non-US national with something like espionage or treason, because the charge of espionage is related to the charge of treason. How can you commit treason when you're not a national of the country? And I would like to see, bulldog liberals. Stand up.
Good point. And I want Medea to talk about that, and perhaps Marjorie too, before we close. Matt Taibbi, writing about this early on and talking about the obscure section of this old, Espionage Act that they're using, says that if they're successful in prosecuting Assange under this obscure section, which basically says, as Chris or somebody talked about, if somebody slips this stuff under your door, you're guilty. It will chill any investigative journalist going forward forever. I mean, it would really represent a blow. Democracies don't survive without a free and vibrant and not fearful press. We'd be in deep trouble. But Vijay was looking at you when he made some of those comments. So Medea, did you want to make a comment as well? And then perhaps Marjorie, and then we'll close.
Well, yes, and I know so many people who have been involved in this work more intimately have been trying to get progressives to speak out. And I think,
yes,
BJ, you're referring to 2019 when Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Ron Wyden all came out against the charges against Julian. But I don't think there's been much success recently. And while there are mainstream groups like Amnesty International and PEN and Reporters Without Borders, we've got to make this much more of an issue where not only do our more scrappy grassroots groups come together with the more mainstream groups like Amnesty International, but we do force those who call themselves progressives in Congress to come out for Julian and against the extradition. Unfortunately, Vijay and Jim, nowadays, we, the people, are not allowed into the people's house. Congress is still closed to us. They said that once the mask mandate was over, we'd be allowed in. The mask mandate is over. We are still not allowed in. And so we can't go to their offices in Washington, D.C. And that is a huge problem that we have to organize against. but we can go to their local offices and we can find them when they're holding press conferences and fundraisers and what else. And they'll be doing that more, of course, as the elections draw nearer. I think that we have to say that anybody who considers themselves a progressive will have to come out against the extradition of Assange, and that we should be counting one by one those people in Congress who come out for against the extradition, be publicizing that very much, and be publicizing those who won't come out. And I'm look forward to working with others in this this webinar and other places in order to do that. So thank you for that constructive call, Vijay.
Yes, thank you both. I'm sorry, Marjorie, was I anticipating you wanted to say something? I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but if you had a last thought, please.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. I think it's really important for people to be proactive. Congress members, the White House, the Department of Justice, they respond to pressure. And I think we need to send letters, we need to send emails, we need to write op-eds and letters to the editor, which are easy to write, keep them under 150 words, peg them to a news story or an editorial when there's a development in the extradition procedure in the UK, when it's in the news, because even if your letter doesn't get published, it will help other letters from the same point of view get published because they count them up. And so I think right now we have to focus on pressuring the US to drop the extradition, to drop the indictment. We're not going to have much leverage with the forces in the UK. But if and when he is extradited here, and I hope he's not, then we need to focus on things like the lack of a fair trial, because it would be in the most conservative district in the Eastern District of Virginia, the prison conditions, which the district judge already ruled would, that plus Julian Assange's frail mental state would lead him, very likely lead him to commit suicide. We need to focus on those issues. But right now, we need to stop the extradition. That's the most important thing. Biden could stop it in 1 minute by dismissing the indictment. But I think Chris is correct that the intelligence community, same CIA, even though Pompeo's no longer the director, was furious when WikiLeaks revealed evidence of surveillance, and they tried to assassinate him, they tried to kidnap him, they tried to kill him. There was a yahoo.com expose on that. This is not something that we're making up. But I second Jim's urging to go to AssangeDefense.org, because there's a tremendous amount of information there about the case and tips about how you can get involved.
Yes, AssangeDefense.org, please. Well, I can't thank all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to thank all the people who joined us online as well. I mean, I've been going through the comments, just a lot of comments, and intelligent comments, smart comments. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more stuff. Appreciative comments. So we thank you. AssangeDefense.org, AssangeDefense.org. Please, my friends, if you take one thing away from this, go and check it out. See all the wonderful groups that are behind us on this. Lend your voice to it. It's a blow for democracy when you do. It's a blow for the freedom of the press, which we need to recover in this country drastically. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and good evening on behalf of Julian Assange Defense Committee and all the other good folks who've worked on this, the LA Progressive. And if I'm forgetting someone, I'll apologize later, but thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, Jim.